Great. So today we're going to be talking about social movements and debating motions that are about them. So it's a bit different to the previous lectures that we've had. All of the other lectures have been on much broader topics and theoretically should be applicable to almost every debate that you engage in. This lecture, on the other hand, is more specific. So it only considers motions which are about social movements. And the reason I've chosen this topic is because social movements actually are quite a common topic. It's like they're a big deal, they're quite important, and especially in the debating world, they come up quite often. So that's why we're discussing them. So first, let's just explain what is a social movement. It's a form of collective action. So you have a lot of people coming together as a group, and there's usually some kind of organizational structure. So maybe they're leaders of some sort, and they're trying to achieve a goal which is usually related to inequality or oppression. So, as a collective, as a group, they believe that they aren't being treated fairly, or that uh, the majority groups are neglecting them, and so they're trying to band together so that they can uh, get like better treatment. And that's like the general gist of it. And I think this makes more sense in context. So here are some examples. The feminist movement, LGBTQ movement, Black Lives Matter. There's also the environmentalist movement. And another one, which I didn't put here, would be movements for animal rights. So all of those things, it's all banding together to achieve some sort of goal because they think they're being neglected. Ayush?
I don't really understand how environmentalists or animal rights is a social movement under the definition you describe. Because with BLM, LGBTQ or feminism, you can discriminate against women, people discriminate against LGBTQ plus. People don't discriminate against PETA supporters. So how is environmentalist and animal rights a social movement under your definition?
Sure. So, of course, people aren't discriminating against PETA supporters, but PETA is a big part of this. I guess for animal rights, you can definitely like try to fit it in under the same umbrella of like animals not being treated fairly and like their rights not being respected. So I think that's like similar enough. Um, but I think maybe you should think of social movements as being broader than that. So it's social in the sense that you're trying to achieve kind of modern like reforms. Um, the environment sort of falls under that as just another um, another like modern issue of uh, the world not being treated right. Like, I mean, it's not such a strict definition, I'd say. So all of these things just happen to fall under it. I wouldn't worry too much.
And are social movements always supposed to be like these broad things, or can they be like local and limited in nature? Like, for example, don't build a stadium in this location or don't do construction. Could that be considered as a social movement if many people are protesting and joining against it?
I think yes, in the sense that like social movements can be more local. I'm not sure about the example you gave of like building a stadium. I'm not sure if that really falls under the same thing, unless it's for environmental reasons. Um, but if it's just like it'll block my view or like it's getting in the way, then no, that wouldn't be social. But yeah, you're right. It can definitely be local, and you could definitely start your own social movement like in your neighborhood or something. It just happens to be that most of the time it'll fall under these categories. Okay, so the yeah, sure, Malila.
Um, can you hear me?
Yeah.
So basically, social movements are just movements against on people like, who are discriminated or not respected, right?
Yeah, more or less. Okay. So the general goals of a social movement are these three things. Representing marginalized people, that just kind of comes innately almost always from the group of people who are trying to band together. They're usually the marginalized people and they're trying to increase their own representation. They're trying to get greater access to rights, which is a similar thing. A lot of the time, maybe LGBTQ, feminist, Black Lives Matter, these are all discriminated groups who might not have access to the same rights or to the same extent um, in to compared to the majority. And finally, redistributing wealth and power. And the kind of assumption that comes under this is basically that people who aren't part of the LGBTQ community, or like in general, those usually in the majority, tend to have a disproportionate amount of money and like power and influence. So, for example, in the US, most likely the people who have the most power are going to be white, are going to be male, and that's just because of like maybe historical reasons, or like they've been given more opportunities before, um, and so they've had an easier time rising to power. And so the goal of the social movement would be protesting so that that money can be redistributed to people in need. So that's just like the overview. But now let's actually get into how do we like consider this in a debating context and what kinds of like different debating motions could come up and how would you respond to them. So each of these things that I'm going to talk about, just think of it as if it's a motion, uh, like a specific debating motion. Okay, so firstly, the main thing to consider when talking about social movements are the issues that could come up within the movement itself. So a lot of the time, what you're going to do in the debate is try to mitigate these issues and like try to solve them in the best way possible. So the first problem that you might be trying to solve is how social movements are quite big and broad structures. And so not everyone who's part of the movement is going to agree on like every little detail. And what this means is there might be subgroups, there might be like factions that break off from each other because these people don't agree. So we can take feminism as an example. For example, pro-life and pro-choice, which is about abortion, whether women should be allowed to abort if they would like to, or if abortion should be restricted, and we should be focusing on the life of the child and preserving that. And so feminists are very broad, but even within them, there are like very large factions that stand for both sides. There's a big pro-life section and a big pro-choice section. And so the debating motion that you might be considering could be along the lines of, oh, should the feminist movement restrict its membership to people who believe in like one or the other of these two like ideologies? And the benefits of that might be you have less internal conflict and everyone in the movement agrees on what their beliefs are, which means they'll be more effective at like explaining their beliefs to other people or just kind of like actually getting change and like protesting effectively, as opposed to like if you have both the groups, then maybe there's too much internal conflict and it's like very difficult to get things done externally, which is like what the actual point is, right? Like there's no benefit in arguing within yourself, within your own group, if you aren't able to achieve real change. So that's like one thing there. Ayush?
So when we're doing the debate, should like with this type of motion,
Mhm.
should we just assume and take for granted that we all support the feminist movement and we would like them to see them succeed?
No, definitely not. So, like, a big part, if that was the case, then, like, the vast majority of the world would already be supporting it and, like, they'd have completely succeeded in whatever they wanted to achieve, right? The reason why they haven't is because there's still so many people who don't support the movement, and either they're just passive and, like, they just don't really care, or they might be, like, actively against it and they think the feminist movement, like, hates men instead of like trying to achieve equality. And there, of course, there are like different factions, as I've said before, right? There are some more radical feminists who maybe resort to violence more easily, and like that's not going to make the public like them very much. So no, you definitely can't assume anything like that. And in fact, most of the time, what you're trying to do is explain if we go with like pro-life, pro-choice, or if we go with like both of them, which one is going to lead to other people supporting the feminist movement more. And that's almost always like the key bit. Like, how do we get more support for the movement?
So when I am debating like this type of motion, I should assume that I support the feminist movement, and then I should choose the option. Then I should say I support pro-life because pro-life would help the feminist movement succeed, and I want to see the feminist movement succeed.
Okay, yes, now I see what you're getting at. Yes, you're going to be explaining what's the best choice to make the feminist movement succeed. So you are trying to help them in that sense. Great. Okay, so that's like the first bit of like often an issue is that they're subgroups. The second issue that often arises is about the leadership structure. So in the feminist movement or in Black Lives Matter or any other social movement, there are different leadership structures. There could be a vertical structure where it's very hierarchical. There are people at the top who are kind of the spokespeople, like PETA in the case of like animal rights, or it could be a more horizontal structure where either you only have leaders on a very local level and they're not actually like that important, or you don't have leaders at all, and that would be something like Black Lives Matter, where there's really no individual that you can point at to say that they are the leader of the social movement. Instead, it's just like a large number of people coming together as a collective, but like no leadership structure at all. But when there is a leadership structure, the issue that arises is who should lead. Oftentimes, the person who ends up leading is the privileged minority. And what I mean by that is you have the feminist movement, and so most people there are like part of that like minority. Uh, but the people who end up leading are going to be the richest ones, and most likely like white women. And that's just like empirically true. And the reason why that's the case is because if you're richer, you probably have more of a voice, you have more influence, you're able to get your like beliefs out into the public more easily. And maybe you have connections as well, which can help the feminist movement. And so all of those things help you get to power. But also, maybe you just have more free time because if you're already quite rich, then you have the free time to be dealing with these kinds of issues. If you're like in a developing country, then most likely you're just trying to make ends meet. And so you can't really like, you don't have the luxury to be supporting a social movement when you're just trying to take care of your family. So there are like very practical reasons as well why you might be restricted in how involved you can get in the social movement. And so quite often it's the privileged that are going to be leading. And why the reason why that's problematic is because the privileged are often not the ones who are most representative of the issues going on. Like the rich white women are like, yes, maybe they understand some of the issues that like the feminist movement stands for, but they probably don't experience like the brunt of the discrimination and the brunt of like the real issues that go on in the world. And so maybe they're not the best spokespeople to lead. And the second issue that can come up is should majority members be included? So in the case of feminism, what that would mean is should men be welcomed into the feminist movement as members? And there are both sides to this as well, right? If you like, maybe you shouldn't welcome men because the feminist movement should be a safe place for women to speak to each other, and they might feel uncomfortable if men are like listening in on their conversations about abortion. Um, or it could also be like if you invite too many men, then they're going to crowd out the women. That like female voices won't be heard if there are men who are like speaking on their behalf. Or the last thing could be maybe it seems like women have to depend on men to get things done if they invite them into the feminist movement as well as like people to support. So there are a lot of issues, but on the other hand, there are also a lot of benefits, right? Because if you don't invite men, then you seem like you're more exclusive, you seem more radical, you seem like you're not trying to fight for like equality and fairness because you're like deliberately trying to exclude people. In which case, men are less likely to support your movement in general. They're more likely to be antagonized by the movement if they're like repeatedly rejected by it. On the other hand, if you like include them, then it seems like you're being much more reasonable and that you are actually trying to encourage cooperation rather than like a one-sided battle against men. So there are benefits to including them as well. And so that's kind of like the way up that you could come up with in a debate. Like the debating motion could be about, oh, should we include men or not? And so yeah, that's like the general issues with leadership. Malola?
How is this related to leadership? Like,
Right.
men just make
Mhm.
up the members, right? So how is it related to leadership?
So the topic could like go a bit further and say, should we invite men to act as leaders in the feminist movement as well? Like that could very easily be part of the topic as well. So that's one.
Okay, and then I also don't get horizontal structures.
Sure. So vertical structures are situations where there are like a few people at the top of the social movement that like might be very wealthy and like maybe like corporate leaders that like PETA, which is like an official organization that supports like animal rights. And so they're like the very clear leaders of the social movement, which is why it's a vertical structure because there's a leader followed by like sub leaders and then like the general public and general supporters. A horizontal structure doesn't have that kind of leadership, um, and like the Black Lives Matters movement, they're just like spread across the world with like no one really being a leader. They're just all trying to do the same thing collectively. In which case you don't have the same issues necessarily, or like you might have different issues because you don't have to worry about like who should lead, or if privileged minorities are leading if there's no leader at all. Okay. So the last bit here is about strategies. The two main things are ideological purity and radical action. What ideological purity means is most likely your social movement has some core beliefs that, like, okay, we stand for A, B, and C. And that's what you're trying to achieve, that's what you're trying to convince people of, and those are your like core philosophical beliefs. But a lot of the time, if you stick to those beliefs like very strictly, it's going to be quite difficult to get your message across, and it's going to be quite difficult to succeed. And so, what you might consider doing is decreasing the purity of your beliefs and like introducing some things which maybe don't fit in. But you know that if you do that, you're more likely to be effective and like more people will support your movement and you're likely to actually achieve your goals. So it's a way up between trying to be more effective or actually supporting what you believe in. And as an example, for the feminist movement, maybe the feminist movement was initially created to be, let's say, pro-choice. Like I don't actually know the historical like origins of it, but if that was the case, then the argument could be should we include people people who are pro-life just because we would then get like so many more women supporting us, but that would decrease our ideological purity. And then the second bit here is about radical action. And you've probably heard of radical action before, but before I go into that, Ayush?
Sorry, I don't really understand ideological purity.
Okay. So let's say you're a social movement, and let's go for animal movement. That's something different. And your core beliefs are that animals should not be eaten at all, that they shouldn't be killed, they shouldn't be eaten. And that's your like core belief. That's what you've been trying to achieve for years. But now you realize like you haven't made a lot of progress, and it's been quite tough to convince people of that. And so what you might choose to do is say, okay, let's say we still eat animals, but at the very least, what about we treat them better while they're alive? Because currently there are a lot of like really bad treatment that goes on, like putting hormones in animals, keeping them in warehouses where they like barely ever like even go outside. So those kinds of things, maybe now you shift your aim to like increasing the quality of life of animals while they're alive, and that decreases like the purity of your initial beliefs. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because hopefully more people are like going to support your movement if it's changing to something which is more reasonable. Ayush? Yeah.
So an example would be like the LGBTQ movement previously would only invite people who were actually LGBTQ and to support their ideological purity. But now to get more support from other people, as they're doing the radical action of inviting anyone as long as they support the LGBTQ community. So that will gain them a lot of extra support and increase the chance that their ideals would be more widely spread.
Yeah, so quite often, kind of the membership issue is also linked to ideological purity. And if you welcome like people who support the LGBTQ community but like aren't actually part of the LGBTQ community, that could be one of those things where the purity of your community is decreasing, but it should lead to more effective like change making. Okay. So secondly is on radical action. And what radical action is usually is like violent protests where you go out and maybe like destroy property of an oil company because you believe because you're part of the environmentalist movement. And so it's like really radical stuff. You're like usually related to violence, which has its pros and cons, right? So the first thing you would need to consider is radical act. So okay, let's say the motion is should they use radical action or not? Okay, and in that case, the things you would be considering are is it necessary? So if you don't use radical action, are there other ways of achieving your goals? Like because most likely you should be using it as a last resort. You shouldn't be like enacting violence when you could be just like talking things out, right? So first you have to justify why it's necessary, why in the past companies haven't listened to you, and so now you have to take more drastic action for them to actually start listening. Because if you like destroy one of their like factories, then they're probably going to care and actually listen to what you have to say. Secondly, is it justified? So even if it's necessary, if like the company hasn't done anything like seriously wrong, then like, it's not justified for you to go and like harm them, right? They're just a company trying to make money. It's like it's not innately a bad thing unless you explain why what they've done is so abhorrent that they deserve violent action enacted upon them. And in the case of oil companies, that could be like, oh, for decades and decades, they've produced so much carbon dioxide and methane, and they've been like digging holes in the ground, just like seriously damaging the environment in every way possible. And so that's why it's completely fair for us to go and like hurt them a bit. And finally, another reason why you might consider using radical action is if you can use it as a bargaining tool. So saying, okay, we'll stop this violence if you give us what we want. So it can be quite a strong tool when negotiating with companies or with the government, because now they actually care, right? Like they have something to lose, and their profits maybe might be damaged if you don't stop. And so there is now a reason for them to stop if you use it as a bargaining chip. So hopefully that makes sense as well. Any questions about that? Malala?
I doubt if radical action is a good strategy because the opposition will just target it and say, why violence, right?
Yeah, so that's definitely a big problem, right? That like you might lose public support, and it's very easy for the media to now start saying like, oh, people don't support the social movement. They're like so radical. All they want is violence. So like there can very easily be bad media representation of your social movement as well. Yeah, and usually it won't look good. Abir?
I didn't quite understand justified and radical action.
So the justified bit is it's similar to like the principles we were talking about. Like principally and morally, is it okay to be like taking violent action? It's only okay to like hurt other people if either they've hurt you or they plan to hurt you. So if you're able to say that, oh, this is self-defense because the environment being harmed directly threatens the life of like my children and me, then it becomes justified to take violent action because it's like self-defense. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Yeah. Ayush?
So what you're saying is basically the justified principle basically means you can under no circumstances like basically do violence against a group or do violence if they haven't like personally done violence or personally wronged you already.
Yeah, I mean, if they haven't done anything wrong, then you're literally just like committing a crime and like, you know.
But like personally wronged you, matlab, if you do violence against an oil company who has been digging for oil legally and everything they do is legally okay, it's just that you personally disagree with them. It's not okay to do violence against them, right?
No, so it's a bit more complicated because almost everything we're talking about is legal. This isn't about like illegal versus legal actions. Almost everything is going to be legal. The reason why you can still say it's justified is because their legal actions of digging up oil significantly harm the environment, which you can say like significantly harms your children's lives. Does that make sense? And it could also be based on reparations as a principle. So saying that, oh, the African American community has been wronged by the US police force in like however many decades. And so for them to now use violence against the police force as part of the Black Lives Matters movement is justified because it's a proportionate response and is reasonable considering how they were wronged in the past.
So you mentioned that if the environmental companies personally wrong you, personally because of their direct actions, it is harming me. So what if the oil company has just done a huge oil spill against the coast of Alaska, and then I in India, who is suffering no direct consequence from this, do violence against them? Would that be considered justified? Because surely, yeah, what they're doing might be morally wrong, but there's no consequence to me. Then is it justified for me to do violence against them?
I think you shouldn't focus too much on the word like personal. Like that's not really what this is about. It's not about like you as an individual. So if it was justified for like anyone else to do it, then it's justified for you to do it.
Got it.
Okay, cool. There's some key takeaways, but honestly, these aren't like that important. They're just uh, summarizing what we've already talked about. So that's not too big a deal. But yeah, I think I'll stop there then.